Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you back, and we're doing a special episode on the history of the Visa Bulletin. I have Charlie here with me. Charlie, let's talk about your personal history with the Visa Bulletin and when you started working with the Department of State. So can you kind of give us, your journey?
Sure. I was chief of the Immigrant Visa Control and Reporting Division for over 23 years. During that time, I was responsible for determining the annual limits and per country limits in the family sponsored categories, where the annual limit is 226,000 visas a year, and also the employment based categories, where the minimum limit is 140,000 plus any unused family sponsored numbers from the previous fiscal year. So I would figure out how many numbers could be used on a monthly basis. That information would be listed in the visa bulletin, indicating who could be processed in the upcoming month. And we would also provide other visa related information in the visa bulletin, because I always tried to warn people if something were going to happen, say a potential retrogression, or the dates were going to move faster, or they weren't going to move at all. I tried to give at least 1 to 2 months advance warning, because I knew it was important to both practitioners and the applicants themselves in terms of planning purposes. So I didn't want people, if I could avoid it, I didn't want people to be caught completely off guard if suddenly the dates stopped moving or there was a retrogression. During my course of the 23 years when I was responsible, over 9 million visas were used by applicants throughout the world. I testified before Congress on 2 occasions when they were having immigration subcommittee hearings on comprehensive immigration reform. And I was often provide analysis of potential reform efforts to both the White House and the congressional offices, telling them if they did certain actions as they were proposed bills, what the implications would be.
So what year did you first start with the visa office?
I actually started with the visa office in the summer of 1979, and I became chief of the Immigrant Visa Control in January of 1998.
So what was it like in 1979 with the Visa Bulletin? Like, how long had the numerical quotas been established?
At the time, the annual limits had been going on for years, and the Visa Bulletin had been published since the early 60s in various forms. When I first started out, there were only 6 visa categories. There were 4 that covered what is now called the family sponsored, and there were only 2 employment visa categories. And then the Immigration Act of 1990, which took effect in fiscal 1992, split that up into the current 4 family sponsored categories and the current 5 employment visa categories. The interesting thing is the family limit really didn't change with the Immigration Act of 1990, but the employment limit went from 54,000 employment numbers being available to the current 140,000 minimum limit. So it was a big change. But in the early days, we actually kept track of things in ledgers. So we had ledgers covering the various countries and for the visa categories, and we actually assigned individual specific numbers when we were allocating numbers to either our overseas post or the immigration service. For example, we might give number for China's second preference numbers to Guangzhou. We may give them numbers 1 through 50. And another post, we would give China's second preference number 51 through 100. So it was and we had to record everything that way. And then we got this thing called a computer that tracked everything. And so that was very interesting. The computer age really streamlined everything and made it much more efficient processing the cases.
But back in those days, before IMAC 90, was there retrogression and backlog?
Yeah, we would actually have retrogressions. So retrogressions is not a new thing. So a retrogression, if a date has been established and then at some point the date moves backward, that's considered a retrogression. Sometimes people refer to a retrogression even if the date is just holding, it's not moving forward, but the date keeps getting further and further behind the actual calendar date. Sometimes people misuse the term retrogression to cover that. Retrogression is not a new issue, and it is going to be an issue that I think we're going to be facing into the future, especially in many of the employment categories where the annual limits are likely to be lower in future years than they have been in the past several years, where the employment limits were artificially high from about fiscal 2021 through the current fiscal 2024 figures, but because of the unused numbers, because of the COVID impact on family sponsored number use by the State Department, I think the annual limits are going to return to more of the 140 to maximum of 150,000 available in the employment categories. And again, that's going to slow many of the employment date movements. And also for over a year now, the rest of world employment second and third preference categories have had final action dates assigned to them, meaning there are no otherwise unused numbers which can be made available to countries such as India. And the use of those otherwise unused numbers has really benefited India's second and third preference in recent years and allowed them to use thousands of extra numbers. That is not going to be the case going forward. And I think that those categories are going to be subject strictly to their per country limits.
So back before IMAC 90, which country would utilize their maximum number usage?
Pretty much the same standard country. We had a few more countries. For example, in the F2A category, there were probably maybe 8 to 10 countries that had at that time the equivalent of the 2A category. And that was part of the reason behind the Immigration Act of 1990 is there was a discrepancy, and Congress decided they wanted to get all of the second preference applicants kind of equalized around the world instead of having a variety of dates. And the impact of IMAC 90 did that. It brought to the second preference category back into line where really the only difference is for Mexico. Mexico has an earlier F2A date than the rest of the world, but countries such as China and Philippines, they have the same dates in F2A as rest of world.
So the migration flows have still traditionally been in those high countries like Mexico, Philippines, China, India throughout the career.
Yeah, it's always been the key countries, and it is only with the categories have got the backlogs have grown with the .com boom.
Yeah.
The proliferation of the internet, everything else, the employment visas have become much a bigger issue in recent years. Well, since the late 90s. And that is much of the demand. It has increased so much with companies bringing in H-1B workers. And most of those applicants that come in as on an H-1B visa, they will become eligible for an employment third preference visa. And eventually with, further skills, move up into the employment second, et cetera. So the growth of the computer and the high-tech industry has really caused a strain on the employment numbers. And Congress really has not addressed this issue. There really has not been any change since the Immigration Act of 1990. So that's a big issue.
Yeah, so let me bring you way back because my dad immigrated on employment-based third preference is my guess, but back then it was 1968, right? And he came from the Philippines. And he tells the story of how he saw an ad in the paper looking for people who wanted to come and work for Boeing in Washington. And he told me his process took like 3 months, from when Boeing sponsored him to when he actually landed in Seattle. So different times.
And if you go way back, at one point, there were actually individual country quotas. And the country quotas were eventually deemed to be unfair. And that's why, in subsequent years, they had in the 60s, in the early 70s, and then with the Immigration Act of 1990, they tried to standardize things and, quote, make it fair or fairer for all types of applicants. One of the
Uh-huh.
things they did is they imposed per country limits, which the per country limit is 7% of the overall limit. And again, they started seeing the potential where a handful of countries could potentially monopolize the vast majority of numbers. And they said, well, we can't let this happen. We're going to impose a 7% limit to try to, equalize the availability of numbers for everybody and quote, make it a little bit fair.
So when IMAC 90 was introduced and they set up all those different categories, I assume you were part of those conversations?
Yes. So
Yeah.
what happens is often Congress would be looking at things, and it's happened, back in 2012 and 2013 was really the last big push for comprehensive immigration reform. And what the congressional offices were doing when they were working on various bills, they would often send those a draft copy to the State Department, also Immigration Service, and they would ask, say, Charlie, if this were to happen, if we were to do this, what are the implications? And what I would do is I would say, well, if you make this change, it's going to have this. This is the potential impact on visa availability, potential workload implications for the State Department, et cetera. I wouldn't be able to say this is a great idea, this is a horrible idea. I would just say this is going to be what happens. And then they could go back and tweak things if they wanted to more closely match what their intended goals were. I always remember that many years ago, this is probably back in maybe the late 80s, early 90s, congressional office proposed a bill which they were thinking was actually going to help their Philippine constituency. They introduced it, and then they sent the bill to the State Department and myself and said, okay, what is the impact of this going to be? And they were expecting it to be great for the Philippine applicants. It was actually detrimental to the Philippine applicants, or at best had no impact on them. And they quickly withdrew the bill. So in subsequent years, most of the offices in the White House would come to us early on with their proposals so that they would see the implication and wouldn't, quote, waste their time going down a wrong path, and they could tweak things as they deemed necessary. And if they were at it to ask, I could make suggestions. Here's a way that you could tweak it to more closely accomplish your goal.
So as I look back on my 26-year career, I remember the Visa Bulletin would be in the newspaper, right? It wasn't available on the internet. My clients would call and I'd say, oh, okay, look in the paper, in the newspaper, that's where you'll find it. We'd say the Philippine News. And then, of course, what you said, like the age of the computer and the internet and all of that. And then the information became more publicly available. And now I still remember one significant milestone in my career where I was at a conference and the Visa Bulletin came out. And we were all so shocked and we were like, are they playing a joke on us? Because all the categories were current for employment base. So can you just kind of give us a little bit of history of what happened there?
Sure. Back in 2007, the USCIS Ombudsman's Office normally would have once or twice a year offsite meetings out of the Washington, D.C. area at one of the USCIS service centers, either the Texas Service Center or Nebraska Service Center. And we met actually at the Nebraska Service Center, and number use had been very low going up to that meeting in May. And the USCIS Ombudsman at the time asked me, he said, Charlie, what are you thinking is going to happen with the dates in the summer based on this low number use? And he said, how many numbers do you need to use? And I had already looked at it, and I knew that in the last quarter, the June through September timeframe, I needed in that 4-month period to use at least as many numbers that had been used in the first 8 months. And so I gave them an actual figure, and he then turned and asked the two service centers, do you all have enough demand to meet this requirement? And the answer was no. They did not have enough. And so I was asked then, what are you going to do? And I said, if there is not enough demand to use all the available numbers, I will need to make the category current. And the USCIS Service Center said, if he makes it current, the people we have in line waiting now, plus anybody that files, that'll give us the best chance of hitting the annual limit if it were to make current. So I made all the employment categories current for the month of July of 2007. And as you said, there was just a dramatic run on numbers.
Yeah.
And we did quickly use up all the available numbers.
Yeah, and I remember filing petitions nonstop. And I think it took for my clients during that, when it became current and we filed the adjustment, I think it took a good 8 years or so before they actually finished the entire process, because then the visa bulletin went backwards, right? It retrogressed.
Right. What happened is it wasn't so much that they didn't have the demand. Leading up to that time, there had been backlogs that were kind of unknown or known, but not really talked about. There were FBI clearances that had to go through. There were Department of Labor things. There were petition approval backlogs. So there were a number of things that were causing the lack of demand, among them processing capacity. And so suddenly when things were current, and then all of a sudden you had more people, like you said, filing to try to take advantage of everything being current, there was an explosion of demand, and that demand could not be satisfied. And then in many of the backlogs, the security backlogs, the petition backlogs, et cetera, were suddenly being addressed. And so it led to lengthy delays.
Yeah. Well, Charlie, thanks for giving us a history of the visa bulletin. Anything else you want to share as we end our episode?
The one thing I would tell people is, especially those processing their cases overseas, is always attempt to appear for your scheduled interview. And I would strongly suggest, unless it is completely unavoidable, appear for your interview in the month that is originally scheduled. Because if you were scheduled, for example, for an interview in April, if you appear for your interview and you're found eligible, you will receive a visa at the end of your quote interview, and you'll be able to immigrate to the US. But if you were to delay your case and ask that it be rescheduled in May or June or whatever, and the visa category were to retrogress in that intervening time, you're stuck. The fact that you were eligible in April, if you're not eligible in May or June or July, your case cannot be processed. And we've seen in some cases where the retrogression has been a year or more in various categories, and you're stuck. So again, it's always important that you appear for your scheduled interview. And if by any chance you're refused, make every effort to overcome that refusal in your original month of interview, because the State Department, if I'm scheduled for an interview in London during the month of April, London has a number which has been allocated for my specific case. So that is important. So they've got a number for me, even if they were to subsequently run out of numbers.
Yeah. So the tip is, when your number is called, you got to make sure you have everything ready so you can grab that number and get approved.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Charlie, for this special episode on the history of the Visa Bulletin. And we'll chat again soon. Thank you.
Take care.